with now, sorry, with keeping children safe for a long time, and he was very, very happy that he accepted this invite. We've been conversing about it. Keeping children safe has been there for a very long time and has been a forerunner in talking about child safeguarding and conversing and bringing out those policies and different aspects. I know recently on the WhatsApp group also, Keeping Children Safe shared some resources, and there were this hoo-has and support from everyone. They are creating a Spanish group, but I'll leave everything for him to share in detail. But before that, the structure of the session and how we'll go ahead, I'll run you through and then hand it to Sam. So, welcome. And yeah, we are very grateful for your presence. It is a 1.5 hour session where there'll be a lot of conversation around the Keeping Children Safe journey, what they offer, what does it mean to be part of Global Schools Forum member, and then what you can access. But there's some things you may not be able to access thereby. There is also a journey of becoming a member of KCS directly as well. But there's a lot you can access as well. So in this 1.5 hour, if you can, switch off certain things and not and switch on yourself completely and be here, we'll be really, really grateful. And your openness will always and always created the magic. So you're open to, converse through chat while Sam is discussing. We can collect those questions and have those onwards. We also have this breakout planned at some point where Sam will introduce one of the tools. So looking forward to a healthy and wonderful conversation. Before we give it to Sam, we also wanted to learn about you and understand who has joined us. So we have two questions. I'll put those questions in the chat as well. But I think if we could, go to this Mentimeter link, there's a QR code. So with your phone, you can just access it. Otherwise, I will put the link on the chat as well. Just give me a minute and then I'll start. So I've put the link in the chat as well. Please give me a thumbs up if you can access the Mentimeter. And if not, then I'll add the questions in the chat box regardless for you. Perfect. So I'm getting some thumbs up. Let me put it on the chat box as well. If somebody cannot, then they can answer over here, and then we'll begin. Let me put the first question. Question. I'm presenting it. Great, we're getting some answers. Let me try and share my screen as well. Great. So we have people from Southeast Asia, New Delhi, Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Cape Town, South Africa, India. That's really amazing. Anyone else? Sam, this gives you a picture. Global Schools Forum is really across 60 countries. So yeah, this is really always really exciting to know where people are from.
Yes, and it's amazing that technology allows us to have these sessions with people all over the world with different experiences and doing different work.
Yeah. And thank you very much for joining across your time zones. It's always tough and challenging, and there are always so many priorities. We don't do justice by giving you an advance of 6 months. We give you an advance of 1 month max many a times. So thank you. Thank you for taking out the time. Others can put it on the chat box as well. Let me move to the next question. is the next question visible for you guys? Let me just... Sam, is the next question visible on the Mentimeter?
Let me.
If
Not yet, Adrian.
No.
Not yet. Okay. Let's skip the Mentimeter for this one because it's always a bit challenging. So what I'll do is I'll put it on the chat box. This is something which you can... Second. Great. So the question is simple. If you were to explain a 5-year-old child that you are a child safeguarding lead, what would you say? You can unmute as well. You can put it on the chat box as well. Let's hear some answers. Yes, George. George, do you wish to share?
Yes, I will.
Please, let us know.
Sorry, the question again.
Sure. So you're a child safeguarding lead, and if you were to explain your role to a 5-year child, what would you say? How would you explain your role?
I will simply say that I am your friend and like you so much. I want to know how you are feeling and how you're doing. And I'm always interested to see you happy and to work with you and to feel free to talk to me at any time I want to talk to you.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We have a few more answers here. I'm somebody that keeps them safe. I help in keeping children like you safe and secure. Great. I help to make sure you're safe. I'm somebody you can come find if you're having big feelings. Oh, that's interesting. Big feelings. Great. Janine, any reason for saying big feelings and not like terming them as negative or any other?
I think that a part of building trust with someone who's 5 years old is you don't only want the relationship to be come and find me when you're feeling sad or angry. Come and find me if you've got a cool story to tell. Come and find me if something exciting happened. Come and find me if something good happened. Let me see that report that you're excited about. That's how you build rapport. That's how you build trust, so that when they are having negative, big feelings, they feel safe to reach out to you because they know this is someone who handles me when I'm feeling big things. This is someone who I feel safe with when I'm feeling big things, whether those are good or bad things.
Wow. No, that's really profound because many times we talk about things when they're problematic and not at the caution level or building a relationship for a relationship itself.
Yeah, I find that the easier they connect with you, the more chance there is that they'll come to you when they are having big feelings, negative big feelings. Because sometimes they're scared or they've been threatened or something has happened and they don't want to share that. So when you've got that rapport, it makes it easier to break down that I'm not quite sure if I should, I'm not quite sure if I want to. So yeah, it's all about relationship building, I feel.
Educate would agree. They build their premise each time on that as well. There are many other answers coming in. Thank you for sharing.
Yes. Hello.
Yes. Please. Go ahead.
Yes. In my own view, explaining my role to a 5-year-old child, young as he or she is, I think my first step should be confidence building and trust. To build the confidence and trust between you and the child, and then you explain your role as a child safeguarding lead. You can do it through a pictorial evidence by showing him or her the pictorial role of a child safeguarding lead, what you are about to do in terms of making him or her feel safe at home, at school, and at community level. So to start with, for you to be able to explain, or for you to be able to interact with the child, confidence building and trust is very, very crucial and key.
So true, so true. I think this is a great segue to introducing Sam. So Sam, over to you. I think Keeping Children Safe has been working with so many organizations. Everyone is really excited to learn about what you do, how they can benefit from it, and how they can also contribute to your journey. So yeah, over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that introduction. And thank you everyone there for getting involved in the icebreaker. Hopefully you continue to get involved throughout. Some really great answers. And I particularly love that whole way of phrasing it with big feelings, particularly when you're working with young children. Your role is definitely to help them understand their rights and things like that, or to give them their rights. But a lot of children won't understand this. So helping them understand it in ways of their feelings, where they will notice those more than they understand their rights necessarily, is a really good way of phrasing it. But let's get straight into it. I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you. So I'd like to welcome you all today to the webinar on an introduction to child safeguarding, both understanding child abuse and child safeguarding. Before we start, I just want to say this is quite a sensitive topic. We always start by saying this may have affected some people in this session, or some people who you know. So please do feel free to leave at any point if you want to. Also, the webinar is being recorded, so I'm sure Ajay will give you a chance to go back and look through any of it if you do miss anything. I'm sure some of you will be aware of some of the things we're covering today, but it's always good to get a refresher. And maybe even if you know a lot about safeguarding, you haven't seen the Keeping Children Safe International Child Safeguarding Standards and how we do things. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either put your question in the Q&A box or raise the hand icon, and I'll stop you and try and answer all of your questions when I can. So a quick introduction to me, as I know most of you don't know me. I'm Sam Gordon. I manage Keeping Children Safe's global network of members, and I'll obviously talk a little bit more about our network in a minute. Previously, before joining Keeping Children Safe, I consulted for the United Nations Office for Internal Oversight Services, working to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse committed by peacekeepers and staff members. And my other form of expertise has always been the UN human rights system, its mechanisms, and how civil society organizations can impact the UN more. So I know we've already done a bit of an icebreaker there and heard a little bit more from you, and you've all introduced yourself in the chat. So I'll now introduce Keeping Children Safe a little bit more. Keeping Children Safe formed in 2002, when a coalition of some of the world's largest INGOs joined together to create the International Child Safeguarding Standards. KCS was created to try and ensure as many organizations around the world were implementing these standards, to ensure that they were doing everything possible to ensure children weren't being harmed. Since then, they've been adopted by thousands of organizations around the world, INGOs, NGOs, governments, militaries, corporations, grassroots organizations, and they really have been designed and shown to be applicable in all different contexts, and for all organizations working with children. There you'll see a map of where our team is based. We're quite a small team, but we're based all around the world. We currently have staff in Uruguay, Guatemala, Italy, Bulgaria, the UK, and our staff member in India actually no longer works there. We have a staff member now working in Thailand. On the right, you'll see a list of some of the things that Keeping Children Safe does. And I know Ajay will share with you a Google Drive document I gave with a lot of links and resources and contact details, so you can access a lot of these things we're talking about in this session afterwards on your own. We have a really wide range of publications that are on our website and free to download, that dive quite deep into a wide range of different safeguarding areas. We do certification and audit of organizations' child safeguarding practice and implementation. We have our capacity building team, who does a really wide range of work, including personalized training, workshops. They also are in charge of conducting investigations. We conduct actual investigation into abuse all over the world as well for organizations. We do quite a large amount of advocacy and research. and we prioritize a few projects each year. The next one we're going to be doing is called the Stop and Check campaign. And we'll be focusing on ensuring that people are checking that when they give money to organizations that they have safeguarding in place. We have our conferences and summits. I don't know if any of you have seen these before, but again, we hold these a few times a year. A really good opportunity to hear from practitioners, experts, government officials from all over the world. And our one that we held two summits ago was actually on safeguarding in education. And you can still find all of those. Again, I provided the link on the page, and all of those talks are still free to download and accessible if you want to go back and look through any of those. And then finally, we have our membership. I'll provide a little more detail about our members on the next slide. But as a part of GSF, you have access to all of our membership benefits that are based around learning and networking with other organizations around the world. This includes our membership WhatsApp community that I know Ajay mentioned, which we're going to be starting a Spanish one soon, or today actually is the plan. We hold 4 members-only webinars a year. Our last one was a couple of weeks ago, focusing on child participation and child-friendly resources. Our next one will be focusing on safeguarding in a digital age. All of you and all of your staff are always more than welcome to attend any of these events as a member of the GSF community. Also, if afterwards, if you want to reach out to me, my email's in that document as well. I can add you to our members-only emailing list that you can use to stay up to date on all of these opportunities that are coming up. And it's also worth mentioning as well that all of you can also choose to join as your own members. On our website, you'll see all of the membership benefits that this provides. It's particularly around the capacity building ones. If you want more direct support on helping you with your policy, on training your staff, these sorts of things. Obviously, Global Schools Forums has grown massively and there's a huge number of members of its community. So it would be impossible for us to provide you all with this more in-depth support as part of the GSF network. So if you do want to discuss that more, reach out to me. And it's worth noting that as part of our charitable mission, any organisation with an annual income of less than £50,000 can join our network for free and access all of our benefits for free as well. So here you'll see just some of our members. We currently have just over 165 members operating in 186 countries around the world. I believe GSF operates in around 60 countries, so we definitely will have members working already and operating in your countries. They really range from small grassroots organizations to large INGOs working in 100+ countries. And they cover all sectors from health, social change, aid, children's rights, sports. And obviously we have a lot of members specifically focusing on education. I believe Peas might actually be part of your community. I think I saw that on your website today. They're a member of our global network as well. And currently, from our most recent surveys, our members help support between 125 and 150 million children each year. So now I've had a bit of a chance to introduce KCS and us and myself. Let's get straight into the webinar. So the objectives of today's webinar are understanding child abuse, what it is, where it occurs, how to identify it, understanding the legal foundation for the protection of children, particularly the importance of these being internationally entrenched and accepted in a variety of laws and conventions. To clearly understand child abuse, particularly the difference between child safeguarding and child protection, and our international child safeguarding standards. And then finally, we'll have an activity to do and go through and understand specifically risk assessments, as this is such a key part of child safeguarding. So if we start with understanding child abuse, just some facts about it, different types of abuse in the legal framework. You'll see here there are just some different random facts about child abuse. I won't go through them all. Some of them are obviously quite shocking, like a child dies as a result of violence every 5 minutes. Some of the key takeaways particularly are the more vulnerable a child is, the more at risk they are of abuse. Abuse really occurs where there are power dynamics, and the larger the power dynamic, the more likely it is for abuse to occur. This means particularly with students who have learning disabilities, If you work in primary and secondary schools, the younger the child is, the more vulnerable they are. Lots of you will work in challenging contexts with low-income communities or people with unstable homes. All of these things make children more vulnerable and more at risk of abuse, and it's very important to be aware of this. And the other thing that I'm sure I'll emphasize again throughout this is how all organizations really do have the responsibility to implement child safeguarding. And we always say this is through the International Child Safeguarding Standards. So one thing we really always emphasize is child abuse occurs in all groups, nations, classes, faith groups, sexualities, genders, religions, ethnicities. There's no group someone that can belong to or title that someone can have that will automatically mean that they aren't someone that could abuse a child. And it's just really important to remember that. Usually the perpetrator is in a position of power over the child and is well known to them. I know recent research shows that 93% of children who are abused know their victims. And it's really important to remember this, particularly in the context you're working in, where teachers and staff can develop relationships with children, that most abuse is not opportunistic or done to strangers, but done by people we know using the relationships they've developed. And finally, people may knowingly or unknowingly do things or fail to do things that significantly harm a child. So it's really important to remember that not everyone who harms a child is going to be someone looking to abuse children. People can harm a child by not understanding what rights are, not understanding what policies and procedures are, not knowing or having been provided with the skills to follow these sorts of things, which is particularly important when it comes to that organizational safeguarding perspective and work we're doing. So if we just start with actually defining what is abuse. So as I mentioned there, abuse is either a deliberately harmful act or harm due to failure of a parent or caregiver, community or organization to provide a reasonable standard of care and protection. Abuse is the overall encompassing term, and within that there are different types of abuse. The 5 main ones we usually focus on are physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, and exploitation. We're going to go through them each one by one and give the Keeping Children Safe official definition of what each type of abuse is. It's really important that we understand exactly what constitutes each type of abuse, so that we can both identify it when it occurs, but also implement the necessary mitigating risks to prevent these type of abuse occurring in the first place. I also know many of you are coming, as we did from the beginning, from different countries all over the world. Some of you within your own organizations will work within multiple countries as well. You'll therefore work in countries that have different laws, different cultural practices, different religious practices. Some of them will include things that are considered abuse. For example, corporal punishment is still legal in over 60 countries in the world. The age of consent is different in different countries, the age of marriage. So it's really important that when working for your schools or your organizations, everyone knows exactly what each type of abuse is defined as, so that it's irrelevant what their own personal perspectives are or personal backgrounds or views. When working for your organization, this is what are considered each type of abuse. So we have physical abuse, which is actual or potential physical harm perpetrated by another person, adult or child. It may involve hitting, shaking, poisoning, drowning, or burning. These are obviously non-exhaustive lists, but we always give examples because of what I just said about what one person might consider abuse and another might not. It's also really important, particularly from the school context, that we always include children in these definitions as well. Some recent studies show that child-on-child abuse results for 25% of child abuse. So particularly when you're working in these environments where children are on a daily basis interacting with each other, children of quite wide age spans, it's really important to remember that abuse can also occur from them, not just from staff. So you then have sexual abuse, which is forcing or enticing a child to take part in sexual activities that he or she does not fully understand or has little choice consenting to. This may include, but is not limited to, rape, oral sex, penetration, or non-penetrative acts such as masturbation, kissing, rubbing, and touching. And then we have these 2 other types of abuse, which are neglect, which is allowing for context, resources, and circumstance, because we obviously appreciate that depending on where you are in the world, you can provide different levels for your children. Neglect refers to a persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical or psychological needs, which is likely to result in serious impairment of a child's healthy physical, spiritual, moral, and mental development. And then we have emotional abuse, which is persistent emotional maltreatment that impacts on a child's emotional development. Emotional abusive acts include restriction of movement, degrading, humiliating, bullying, including cyberbullying, and I know I'll mention online abuse again, and threatening, scaring, discriminating, ridiculing, or other non-physical forms of hostile and rejecting treatment. And we often say, I think people are often preoccupied with or more focused on physical or sexual abuse. This is partly because they're the most visible to us, and I think partly also because they're the most viscerally shocking to our systems. However, it's really important to be aware of all the different types of abuse. Obviously, in the most extreme cases of both of these, a child can take their own life if they're emotionally abused enough, and neglect can result in serious physical illnesses, which can be just as serious as the other two forms of abuse. So there are a few other types of abuse that are worth, and terms that are worth knowing. Child sexual exploitation is a very specific type of sexual abuse and involves manipulating or coercing the child, usually through trading or providing resources, money, protection, food. It's particularly difficult because the victim often doesn't know that they've been abused, because they think that a fair trade has happened within this exchange. You then have internet abuse and abuse of images of children. I know in the last 4 years alone, this has risen by 80% in the UK, and can obviously occur via the internet, social media, gaming, emails. You have grooming, which is when an adult specifically targets a child and goes through a process of isolating them and creating dependence in order to sexually abuse them or exploit them in the future. Commercial abuse, which is abuse of a child through their labor or their image. Spiritual abuse, I'm sure many of you are aware of the Catholic Church scandals that happen around the world. This obviously occurs in a lot of religions and is about abusing your position as a leader, spiritual leader. And then you have abuse of trust, which I'm sure will fall in line with a lot of you as well, but is when someone in a position of power over a child, whether that's a teacher, a counselor, a sports leader, abuses that position of trust, again, to be able to abuse a child. And I can see there that someone did write in the chat a question on how do we handle child abuse. And I think we'll get into that a lot more in the second half when we go through our standards, because although there will be different procedures that you need to follow, a lot of those sorts of things, particularly as a school, will be outlined in your child safeguarding policy or in your reporting guidelines. And it's really important to have very clear steps that you take in order to ensure that the children are protected, and in order to ensure that it's followed up and investigated as soon as possible. But we'll talk about those sorts of things a little bit more later. So child abuse challenges some of our basic beliefs about the world. For example, that a parent or someone working for a charity would never harm a child. We might assume that people who work for charities have humanitarian beliefs, so surely they would never harm a child just because a child's accessing the services. This obviously aligns with schools as well. You like to think that everyone that works as a school, as a teacher, has an altruistic idea of wanting to educate children and rise them up as well. But you just cannot ever assume that just because someone, again, is belonging to a certain religion or does a certain job, doesn't mean that they might not harm a child. The best example we give of this is Britain's most prolific paedophile, who abused hundreds and hundreds of children that they know of. Wrote a guide on the dark web on how to be a successful paedophile. It's about a 75-page guide. And the two main things that we always say people can take away from it are, one, he says you always find the most vulnerable children in the world. So this is particularly important for those of you that are working in more vulnerable contexts. And the other one he says is you find an organization that has already developed and fostered trust within the community, and you exploit or groom that organization. The term I used before, pedophiles try and groom organizations who have already got a large impact. That way, someone who may say a teacher looking to abuse a child doesn't have to foster trust with hundreds of children themselves. They just have to become a teacher at your school, and suddenly they have all of this access to children that will already trust them. So it's just a tactic we have to be very aware of, and it's why safeguarding and recruitment is so important, because it's the first stage in ensuring someone that is looking to abuse a child cannot access your organization. So child abuse can happen anywhere, in the home, in the community, throughout our organization. Our primary responsibility is the latter. I always say it's fantastic if you want to do work within the local community and you want to impact on how parents are parenting in the home and all of these sorts of things. But when it comes to safeguarding, we're specifically focusing on our organization, and how our organization could be negatively impacting a child. So to do this, we need to understand what we do as an organization that could potentially harm a child. So the three ways we do this are understand how we come into contact with children. This is through people, which includes all your staff and associates, and we'll talk later about what falls into this. Your programs, which are the actual activities you're conducting, whether this is your education programs, your lessons, extracurricular activities, food programs, or other things that you might be doing as part of your education. These are all your programs. And then you have your operations, which are internal communications, your use of social media, all of those sorts of things, how the organization mechanically actually runs. So we always need to identify the different ways that we come into contact with children. We need to then identify who within our organization has access to or impact upon children. And you'll notice that we don't just say come into contact with, but it's also how you impact upon them. Your organization may impact on lots of children that you don't come into direct contact with. For example, the children of your staff members are impacted by your organization, even if you don't come into contact with them. And then once again, know how contact with children and vulnerable adults can be made via the internet. I'm sure many of you are working in countries where internet access is becoming more and more prevalent, particularly with the younger generation. So it's so important to be aware of how abuse can occur online. So here you'll just see a list of the different ways where we say organizations can come into contact with children and impact upon children. You may not have thought of some of these. We'll quickly run through the list. I know we've got governments, management, planning, financial management, human resource development, product and service delivery, which is what most of you will think of with the work you're doing, which is actually providing education and support to children. Resource development, which is fundraising, IT, program or project management, volunteer management, communications, public relations, monitoring and evaluation. And I'm sure on that list, some of you will have seen things that you haven't have thought of and ways that your organizations might come into contact with children. But again, it's only by understanding the different ways that we can start to identify the risks and start to mitigate all of the risks, as well as ensuring we have all the necessary policies and procedures in place. This list also highlights, again, why everyone at your organization needs to be aware and part of safeguarding. Because the safeguarding lead or your safeguarding focal point isn't going to be able to do all of, or isn't going to be in charge of necessarily fundraising or financial management. It's not their job. So everyone has to be working together to ensure that the safeguarding element is included in all of these different sections. So we'll quickly go through the legal framework now. I think this is particularly useful for your network and community because you work in so many different countries who will be at very different stages nationally of understand, or in their local communities of understanding safeguarding as a term, of understanding different elements of child protection. Different laws are different. I know from Keeping Children Safe perspective, we've obviously focused a lot on trying to not be seen as Western influencers, trying to impose our Western values. So we use this to show to others why safeguarding and safeguarding principles really are entrenched already around the world. And it's obviously useful for all of you to then be able to show within your local communities and with the parents you're working and the children and nationally why it's also important for you to be doing. And the top level we always start with are the international laws. There's a really wide range of human rights laws, refugee laws, humanitarian laws that all provide rights from abuses of harm and provide specific children's rights. You have the organizational policies and bulletins, particularly the UN ones. So our international child safeguarding standards, and we encourage all of our members' policies to be primarily based or draw from the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. This is because it's the most widely accepted document in the world. All but 2 countries have signed onto it, the US and Somalia. So it's a really good starting point for something that's been universally accepted. It's also then through regional treaties been adopted further. So we use the European Framework on the Laws of Child Rights, or I know we have people from Africa today, the African Charter on the Rights of the Welfare of the Child, draw directly and sometimes take word for word from the from the UN Charter on the Rights of the Child. It's been adopted in Asia, in Latin America as well, and again are really useful for showing that regionally it's been adopted further. And then you also have the national laws as well. All of your countries will have some national laws. I've done webinars for lots of people in the countries you work in. You will have some national laws around child protection that you can always draw upon to show that the idea and the concepts behind child protection and children's right to be safe are also enshrined in some national laws as well. And I know some of you may say that the national laws haven't been adopted or fully spread around the country yet, but once they exist, it's a really useful thing to be able to draw upon to show that these things really are locally appropriate. So we'll move on to the understanding child safeguarding part of it now specifically and get more into our international child safeguarding standards. We'll start by defining child safeguarding. A lot of people, when I ask what child safeguarding is, they go, I know, and then they give me the definition of child protection. But child protection refers to all protection from violence of exploitation and abuse, as Article 19 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child says. In the international context, it describes the work being undertaken to strengthen laws, policies, and systems, which are designed to protect children in their given country or in his or her own family and communities. So I know you work in education and you're not in the aid sector providing that sort of aid. However, if any of you do run fundraising projects, if you're providing funds or food programs to children who come to your schools, these sorts of things are all the child protection work. It's outward work organizations are doing to support and protect children. When it comes to child safeguarding, we're referring to a set of policies and procedures and practices that an organization employs to ensure that it itself is a child safe organization. It's the responsibilities that organizations have to ensure that their staff, operations, and programs, and I'll use that phrase again because it covers everyone at your organization, do no harm to children, and that any concerns are sent to the appropriate authorities. So it's all of you, I know, as organizations are trying your hardest to support as many children as possible, to do as much good work and provide great life opportunities to the children you're supporting. But it's about how do we ensure that whilst we're doing all of this fantastic work, we aren't accidentally harming any children in the process. A lot of these safeguarding really became a much more popular term after the giant aid sector scandals that happened across the world in the 2000s and the 2010s. In the UK, the big example was Oxfam, where these organizations were being given millions of pounds to go around the world and support all these children. And then reports were coming out. In the Oxfam one, it was that they'd gone to Haiti and fathered hundreds of children that they'd abandoned with the people they were meant to be helping, and they'd exploited them. So it's about how do we ensure that whilst we're doing all of this great work helping people, we aren't causing these children any harm, which particularly the larger you grow as an organization, the more of an impact you are going to have. So again, we need to know where, when, and how we affect children. We then go, what policies and procedures are needed? Who are the appropriate designated child safeguarding focal points? What safeguarding induction and training is needed? And what your code of conduct is at your organization. You'll see there something we always emphasize. Even if you have the perfect policies and procedures in place, You can never, ever 100% guarantee that someone isn't either going to accidentally harm a child or isn't going to turn around one day and just decide to harm a child or abuse a child. It's therefore equally as important that we all have the correct response policies and procedures in place, so that if this does or when this does occur, we have everything in place to ensure that we're supporting and helping the child as much as possible, not just trying to prevent it. So before we go through the standards, we say why have standards? We obviously use this to tell and promote to others why you should use them. But obviously, once you are using the standards, it's great to be able to explain to your children and your teachers and staff and everyone why you're using these standards. They're obviously good for promoting good practices at the organization and ensures that all of your programs, operation and staff aren't putting children at risk of harm's way. They obviously fundamentally protect children and enable you to respond appropriately when concerns and incidents arise. And they provide a comprehensive benchmark for preventing harm to children. And I know we had that question before on how to respond to child abuse. And standard 3 is procedures, and this exactly shows why it's important, and then we'll give some ways of how you actually implement these sorts of procedures. So here are our guiding principles. These are the guiding principles behind our international child safeguarding standards, and we recommend them being the guiding principles behind all of your work. The overall guiding principle is do no harm. We think if an organization tries to not harm any child, this is the best possible thing to obtain. Obviously, as we mentioned before, what one person defines as harm, another person might not. So we add the other principles to give more depth. And the first one is all children have equal rights to protection of harm, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, etc. And this really emphasizes non-discrimination. Everybody has a responsibility to support the protection of children, and this is regardless of whether you have a safeguarding role or responsibility. Everyone will have some at the organization. We emphasize organizations have a duty of care to the children who they work with. Again, stemming from the fact that unfortunately large organizations and NGOs in the past didn't feel this responsibility particularly heavily. And then finally, all actions on child safeguarding must be taken in the best interest of the child, never in the best interest of the organization, or in some cases, the perpetrator, just because you know them or you're friends with them. And our final principle is working with partners. We really emphasize how organizations need to ensure that if you're working with partners, and whether that's local partners or international partners, you are also ensuring that they're meeting minimum requirements. Again, this stemmed, unfortunately, the aid sector didn't give itself much of a good reputation, but it stemmed from large organizations using thousands of implementing partners around the world. And then if one of the implementing partners committed abuse, they said, well, that wasn't us, they don't work for us. We obviously believe this is completely unacceptable. And if you're providing people with support or access to children, you need to be ensuring they also aren't harming them. And just some of the ways we track this are through annual safeguarding reports, ensuring partners have their own policies in place or sign your policy before partnerships begin, and ending partnerships for persistent lack of implementation or response to safeguarding incidents. And just the 3 main advantages of our standards as well are children are protected, obviously the most important. One that people don't think of as much is the fact that your staff and associates are protected as well. Your staff are protected by knowing what they should and shouldn't be doing, by being provided with the skills to perform their roles. And also, for example, I know many schools have policies like 2 adults to a room, for example, so that a child can't be left alone with an adult. That obviously protects children, but also protects the adult from false allegations and things like that, or from just being caught in compromising situations. And finally, the organization and its reputation is protected. We obviously say this is the least important. We're focusing on the children, but it is a nice benefit of not harming children that you get to continue doing all of the work you're doing and keep on bringing in funding and have your reputation protected. So if we just go through our standards one by one, the first one is policy, which is your organization developed a clear policy that describes how it is committed to preventing and responding to abuse of harm. The policy, as we mentioned, should reflect the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, and it really needs to be approved by the senior management. This is really important for creating organizational cultures at your school that focus on safeguarding, particularly from the top-down perspective. And it needs to apply to all your staff and associates. We'll talk about the scope of the policy, of the scope of your policy in the next section, but it's about not just ensuring that teachers not just teachers are covered by your policies, but all people that work with the organization. So why should you meet this standard? Developing a child safeguarding policy makes it clear to everyone children must be safeguarded and not put at risk of harm. It outlines exactly the measures that are in place to respond to concerns appropriately. It provides a clear commitment to all staff and associates, which they would have all committed to through signing. And really, the policy is the foundation of your school or organization's safeguarding approach and mechanisms. So I know a lot of you will already have safeguarding policies in place, but I'm also aware some of you will be at different stages of your safeguarding journeys. The first stage we always do is designing your policy. The second stage is writing and signing off of the policy. And the third stage that I really want to emphasize is making it available and publicizing it. It's often the forgotten stage. I'm sure I'll say it again in this, that if a policy is left in a drawer somewhere or on a wall and never used or shared, however good it is, it's not going to be effective. So ensuring that staff have access to it, children do, partners, family and communities is really important. I won't go through this in too much detail, but this is just our suggested policy structure, which always begins with just an introduction, with then the policy statement and your values and the purpose of it. What are the problems you're trying to address? And then the main part of the policy, which we'll go through in more detail coming up, which is commitments to risk assessments, safe recruitment, behavioral protocols, code of conduct, training, communications, etc. So for each one, I'm going to provide some ways of providing evidence for it. This is useful for keeping record for yourselves of whether you are actually hitting each of these standards. It's useful for if GSF ever asks you to provide evidence. And if you did ever want to become an accredited or certified member of KCS, which are our higher levels of audit, these are the sort of things we would ask for as well. So a copy of your policy, one that's been signed by management and reviewed in the last 3 years, copies of your policy being made available online, ensuring that your policy is translated into local languages, and examples of ways you've promoted your policy, whether this is with partners and children and communities, pamphlets, posters, sessions, those sorts of things. And I'll just give a few do's and don'ts to each standard. We always say, do use other child safeguarding policies to inform yours, but don't just replicate it. Do work with relevant staff members to disseminate it. I know I just mentioned the importance. It's really important to try and develop child-friendly versions of your policy. We know that children are unlikely to read a 60-page document, even if they could understand it. But fundamentally, your policies require there to be a certain amount of depth. So we really recommend people developing 1 or 2-page documents, mainly images, diagrams, colorful, that help a child know what their rights are and where they report within your organization. And then finally, once again, just don't develop a policy that sits in the office somewhere. It's really important to actually use it and make sure it's being implemented. So the second standard is people, which is your organization places clear responsibilities and expectations on its staff and associates. And importantly, also helps them to act in line with this and provide them the skills to do this. So again, everyone has a role to play in safeguarding, not just those with a safeguarding role. And this is particularly important for schools and the sorts of organizations you are. As children, all research shows, are unlikely to report through official reporting mechanisms or to your official safeguarding lead. Children often report to either their nearest and most accessible adult, or the one that they feel closest with and have a direct relationship with. You therefore never know who at your organization might receive a report or an incident. You also never know who might see one happening by complete chance. So at a minimum, everyone at your organization needs to be aware of what children's rights are, how to identify abuse and where to report it if they see it. Organizations need to ensure everyone understands safeguarding in their role. And here you'll see the scope I was referring to, of you need to ensure that it applies to everyone at your organization. And we use the term staff and associates. Some people have other terms. But staff refers to all staff, both full-time and part-time staff, national and international, and volunteers and interns. I know some people don't think of volunteers as being in your staff. And then associates include contractors, consultants, board members, partners, and guests and visitors. Again, I'm sure particularly board members, guests and visitors may have quite involvement with your schools. Trustees might come and visit them all the time. It's really important to be aware that they are also have to fall in line and fall under your safeguarding policy. So why should organizations meet this standard? It ensures everyone understands safeguarding and aware of their role in it. It ensures everyone understands how and where to report. Reporting is such a key part of the safeguarding process, which is why we emphasize it over and over. And it ensures that staff and associates are safe to work with children, both through safeguarding and recruitment and through receiving the proper training. So just some ways to meet this standard. Ensuring you have key safeguarding focal points with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. The role of the focal point is quite diverse and includes implementing the policy, updating it, ensuring staff are trained, responding to safeguarding incidents. So it's really important at least one person has this clear defined role and provided with the training for it. Recruitment processes need to have strong safeguarding in place. This includes criminal background checks if they're allowed in your country, and self-declaration forms if you can't do a criminal background check. Requiring 2 verified references, interviews to include discussions on safeguarding, proof of qualifications, etc. I always say safeguarding in recruitment is the first stage to stopping someone looking to abuse a child from accessing your organization. There should also be written guidelines for appropriate behaviors for both adults towards children and children towards children. I know the person's question was on how to respond to this, but obviously a big part of it as well is ensuring that children are aware of abuse that can occur from each other, and guidelines for how to respond to it. This includes the code of conduct, communications guidelines, reporting guidelines, social media guidelines. If children have access to the internet at school through ICT programs or technology classes, again, you need special procedures on how they can access the internet and ensuring they understand it. And then finally, staff receive safeguarding training. All staff should really receive induction training. There should be refresher training throughout the year. And we say staff with the focal point or more advanced responsibilities should really receive more additional training within the first 6 months. So just some ways of providing evidence for this. A copy of training plans, course attendance, course evaluations to show training is happening. List of contacts for specialist advice and information within the organization. Samples of recruitment adverts and employment contracts to include safeguarding, and then just examples of the different guidelines and codes of conduct, etc. And just some quick do's and don'ts. Do make sure all people are aware of the potential risks of your policy and their obligations. And we always say discuss openly with partners and children and families what you're trying to achieve and work with them. And child participation is often a key part of child safeguarding. I always say to someone, if you want to know where a child is going to feel safest to report something, ask them. They're going to be more likely to know than anyone else. And once again, don't assume that everyone who works with children is going to be safe and will do them no harm, even if they've passed your recruitment processes. We've always said something like a criminal background check, which is really essential, is only as good as the day that the check was conducted. And also most criminal background checks don't work internationally either. So you can only do it from when someone came to the country. So just always be vigilant. So our third one is procedure, which is your organization creates a child safe environment through implementing your child safeguarding procedures. So safeguarding policy commitments must be integrated into existing processes. Just for an example, I know people often do risk assessments for health and safety, which is obviously important, but if you're already doing that and not doing a safeguarding one, you just include safeguarding. If you're not already doing the risk assessment for whatever reason, you develop one for safeguarding. A procedure details how you turn the policy into a living, breathing, working document that's actually being implemented within the organization. And then we say organizations should really carry out local mapping exercises that cover the legal, social welfare systems, child protection arrangements, which are really important and useful for contextualizing your policies and our international child safeguarding standards around your local work and areas you're in. Particularly if you're an organization that works in multiple countries or a school that has schools in multiple countries, your general overall umbrella safeguarding policy will be the same for each, but it's really important to use local mapping exercises and other contextual tools to ensure their procedures are adapted to their local context. So why should organizations meet this standard? It firstly ensures your policies being effectively implemented. It ensures you have all of the appropriate mechanisms for responding to incidents and supporting victims. And it ensures that your operations programs and activities are being implemented with all the necessary safeguarding measures. So again, just some ways to meet this standard. Child safeguarding risk assessments need to be conducted and mitigation strategies as well and incorporated into existing ones. And our activity today is on risk assessment. Child safeguarding measures need to be integrated into existing processes, whether that's budgeting, recruitment, program cycle management, strategic planning. And then a reporting and responding process for incidents needs to be developed that's locally appropriate. Lots of schools have different ways of doing this and organizations, including, as well as the reporting person, having anonymous reporting boxes, having online or telephone or text places that they can report as well as having multiple different teachers and sources that they can go to. Particularly for staff, it would be really useful to develop a reporting flowchart that just shows staff exactly where they should take a report to in different circumstances. The go-to example I give is often if you say to a staff member, where do you take a report? They'll instantly say the focal point of the safeguarding lead. And then you say, what about if the incident or report is about them? And then suddenly there's a bit of a pause because that's a bit more complicated, but staff need to be aware of what to do in all situations. Just some quick ways of providing evidence for this. Risk registers that you can use to show you're doing your risk assessments and you're creating mitigation strategies, keeping copies of all local mappings you ever do, and having examples of your reporting flowcharts in your offices. So we'll just move on to the last standard, accountability, which is what I call the forgotten standard, which is your organization monitors and reviews its safeguarding measures. Your organization really needs to have in place measuring mechanisms for monitoring and reviewing safeguarding measures to ensure both upwards and downwards accountability. We need to do both active monitoring, so before things go wrong, and reactive monitoring, so after you have a near miss or after something goes wrong, please look into it, particularly with a near miss if it hasn't actually happened, to assess why this happened, why could it happen in the future, and how do we prevent it happening again. Learning from practical case experiences informs how we change our policy and change our procedures over time. It's the only way that we can actually see if all of the hard work that we've been doing on safeguarding has been effective and is having the effect that we want. We should really monitor it regularly, use implementation plans to monitor it yearly. And we should also report to key stakeholders, whether this is GSF or independent bodies or your board of trustees, etc. So just some quick ways of providing evidence for this, using our self-audit tools, having internal audit reports. We do our own certification that I mentioned at the very beginning, but other organizations do this as well, and including it in publicly available annual reports. Some quick do's and don'ts. So do be transparent with your information on child safeguarding and respond appropriately. Your organization's credibility depends on it. I always say to organizations, when you start focusing heavily on safeguarding, you're likely to get more reports at the start than for reports to go down. And this is not a negative, it's a good thing, because these incidents were happening anyway, you just weren't receiving reports of them. At least now you know your reporting mechanisms are working effectively and receiving reports like they should. Don't rely on having a policy as a measure of accountability. Being accountable is ensuring that your policy is actually being implemented. And do put as much effort into monitoring and reviewing as with implementation. And as I mentioned, it's the only way whether you know the hard work you're doing is being successful. So I know I've done a lot of talking there, and I'm going to do a little bit more before giving you a chance for the activity. We've got a chance for you to actually work together a little bit more and share some ideas. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be doing this specifically around risk assessments. So risk assessments are something that you should be conducting annually. And also before you conduct any new program or activity, you should be conducting new risk assessments as well. I'm quickly going to talk about what a risk assessment is and why it's important and how to carry it out. So a risk assessment is analyzing any situation, operation for potential occurrence which may negatively impact the people your organization is in contact with, particularly children, but I guess also vulnerable adults as well. Some of your children, their parents might be vulnerable adults. So we always say safeguarding risk should be the #1 risk focused on at your organization. And of course, the risk to others, not the risk to the organization. Often when people do this exercise, the first thing they say is the risk is our organization's reputation will be harmed. That's not what we're focusing on. This activity is on the risk to the children we work with. So why carry them out? Of course, it identifies potential risks. It helps you understand the level of risk for each risk, and helps you strengthen your actual measures when designing programs and operations. So what is a safeguarding risk assessment? They record various pieces of information relating to the risks, including example of any potential consequences. They provide a platform for preventing risk mitigation, and they form a part of wider risk assessment processes, as I mentioned, for other things like health and safety, not just for child safeguarding. So who and when should they be carried out? All business function department managers should really work together to see the risks that arise from their department. As I mentioned, for example, fundraising, your social media teams are going to have different risks arising from sharing the images of children to those working directly with children on a day-to-day basis. So this should also include program and project managers. And then when, as part of your program, project design or investigation, for any activity or operation through which your organization has contact with children, periodic reviews, which are the yearly ones I mentioned, and any specific events you're running through the year involving the community or with local children. So I've just got a quick example here for you to see before we go and give you the activity to do. I know Ajay shared the Google document with you, which has this exact template, just without anything in it. So we have who is at risk in the first one. It's children who are attending our school. What factors place them at risk? For some of you, children will be walking alone to schools in the dark where they could come across strangers. What's the risk? Of course, the risk of the child being assaulted or sexually assaulted or harassed. In this case, it's quite a high risk. We then have what controls could you put in place? For example, children being brought to schools in groups by either NGOs, approved local community members. It's then by whom is going to do this. So for that specific one, it needs to be approved by the programs director, and then by when. And obviously setting a date and a target is a really useful way for keeping track of these sorts of things. And there's a second example there, but we're going to split you into groups now, into just even groups to come up with some of these and start filling it in yourself. We'll then bring you all back together after about 15 minutes and get someone from your group to just go through the risks you identified and some of the strategies you thought of.
I just want to see if there's any urgent question, otherwise.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all. Because there were 2 questions, but we can even take them at the end. But any questions around the activity? We will have 10 minutes. it's a good chance for you to introduce each other as well and get to know each other as well. And the risk assessment template is there, but if you could walk through what they're expected to do in the group, like, they should identify 3 risks in their organizations, or how?
Sure. So I guess in the 15 minutes, rather than set a target of 3, let's see how many you can do. Identify risks that you are specifically facing in your organization. If you're with people from other organizations, some of you may face the same risks, some of it may be special to yours, and just go through this table and try and fill in as much as you can in the 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and you can share the risks that you identified.
Perfect. In the interest of time, I've made it 10 minutes. Yeah, just so that we can close it timely and have time for questions as well. But if you could give me a thumbs up, and if every instruction is clear when you're going to the group. Okay. Shavi's thumbs up has come up. Great. So, and you have the risk assessment template, which is opening as well. Let me divide you guys into the rooms. Perfect. I'll just make it 2 rooms. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. There's 3 rooms now.
Would you like me to keep on sharing my screen with the breakout rooms so you can see the example?
I think you can jump into rooms. That's easier. And let me
Perfect.
stop. In this case, the smile and the spirit of the hope that we can do this work together in our different contexts and not on the harm. So, yeah. Great. 3, 2, and 1. Perfect. Thank you very much. Over to you, Samuel. I know they had questions as well, so, and a lot of rich discussion.
Perfect. So I don't know if someone from one of the other groups wants to share what they were working on first, rather than the group that I was in for the majority of the time.
Would anyone like to share what risk came up? Were they different or similar to what Sam was discussing?
Yes. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. In our group, we explain the various activities we are rolling out in our different countries. Like for Sierra Leone, I shared with my colleagues that we are operating a
So it's not just me that's having this connection difficulty, is it?
Yeah, I think
innovation challenge. We are operating in 67 schools across 3 districts: Bond, Moyamba, and Pujem. And in that light, and protection issue is quite
Augustine, unfortunately, your voice is breaking up. If you could share your thoughts on the chat, that might be easier. Sorry about that. Anyone else who would like to share? And even this is a good platform to ask questions. We have 10 more minutes. So if you have questions for Sam, I'm putting the future events also, but yeah. Augustine, it would be best if, yeah. Yes, George, would you like to share?
Yes, I think I was excited to see that because I shared in the group that is my first experience really. Normally, when we are designing programs, we do risk analysis for projects and not very specific to child safeguarding. And so I was so excited, my first experience to see a risk tool like that nature. And maybe I was even outlining some of the children that we have that are at risk. I spoke about children that walks very long distances to school, the school environment not very friendly for children with disabilities, and we also have children that are coming from extremely very vulnerable homes, and such children are really at risk, likely not to be attracted to any abuse. But I will usually say that one of the intervention, like in our own context here, we call what called Guide Child Empowerment Program. And children in primary 4, 5, and 6 girls, particularly, we have a special structured kind of sessions, Guide Child Empowerment session for them that creates opportunity for self-awareness, some others knowing about themselves, how can they manage certain situation at their level, and how just to create opportunity how they can feel free to share their experiences. And that's one way, as somebody said, maybe confidence building, that these guys might be going through abuses, but they are not given the opportunity. They don't have somebody that they trust that they can share these things with. So I think that's just what in our own context we are doing at the moment for the upper primary children.
Yes, and it was a perfect contribution to the conversation we were having because it showed a completely different risks to the one we'd been discussing before, which was someone who was working specifically in physical education, where you have risks in a school around changing rooms. In the example that we were provided, they didn't have separate gendered changing rooms, which obviously provides quite a high level of risk. Changing rooms anyway provide risks because of staff monitoring and interaction with children. You also then obviously have risks for the department that work on fundraising or community projects for the school that may be taking photos or posting images of children online, and that poses another whole area of risks. Which is why we particularly wanted to emphasize that really everyone should be involved in the risk assessment, and because all departments will probably be having some impact or risk to a child.
I think Jacqueline has a question. Jacqueline, please go ahead. Jacqueline? Jacqueline, if you want to check you're on mute, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right, thank you. I work for Rising Academies, and the greatest challenge we are currently facing is supervision in schools, in the sense that most of, I did an analysis of the last 3 years' concerns, and I realized that most of the concerns are as a result of lack of supervision in schools, where we assume that when the children are in the school environment, they are safe, but then things happen in the toilet, things happen in empty classrooms. So that is the greatest challenge that we are facing currently. Of course, we are looking to put in measures to address that, but you can also put in some ideas for us to be able to adopt. And then the other thing is age-appropriate disciplinary measures. You find that children below 7 years old are messing. So how do you punish them? How do you apply the disciplinary measures that are appropriate at that particular time? Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So there's two things there that we can tackle separately. And one of them we'll go with first because it applies to the risk assessment, because again, you've clearly identified their risk that you particularly face at your school, which is monitoring. and you've further identified children going to empty classrooms. There are obviously quite a lot of different procedures that we can recommend to help with these things. Obviously, it would require knowing slightly more about the school infrastructure and things like that. But the sort of thing of ensuring that classrooms are locked when no one's in them, ensuring that if there are windows, that there are always blinds up so that teachers can see in them. Toilets is a very difficult one in schools because we do appreciate this is very hard to monitor. But again, we do have sorts of resources that we can provide you and delve deeper into that. The other one is age-appropriate discipline, which we do a huge amount of work on, especially on appropriate discipline in the first place. Some of you may still work in communities or contexts where physically disciplining children is still allowed. And there are also lots of other forms of harmful forms of discipline that aren't actually physical abuse, say you're locking a child away or something like that. This also equally applies to having appropriate discipline measures. We have a huge range of resources we can provide on alternative forms of discipline, effective forms of discipline, the negative impacts of harmful forms of discipline. Obviously, those are really good to inform training and information you're providing to teachers to ensure they're doing the right practices. We've only got a few minutes left, but if someone does have another question, unless Ajay, you wanted to close it out with a...
I have shared a poll as well. It would be really, really helpful if you could fill out the poll as well. It's helpful for us to get the feedback so that we can learn from you as well simultaneously. I think there is a question in the chat box. Some of the risks identified include... Oh, okay, so that's Augustine giving us a summary. That's great. Great. Thank you so much, Augustine, for that. I think there was abuse by children with children. I think that was a question which came up earlier. I don't know if you have a response to that.
Sure. So I would say on abuse with children, the majority of your reporting and responding procedures are going to stay the same, particularly when it comes to supporting the victim of it. The biggest difference in that would be how you deal with the person who's committed the abuse. There's obviously a big difference between how you have to respond if a staff member's done it and how you respond if a 10-year-old has done it. It's again why we'd really recommend having local mapping of people who can support you in certain areas, such as potentially local child psychologists or local people in the authority that deal with children who have committed offences, because often you may not either have the expertise or the resources to deal with certain cases. Maybe you do have speciality in internally to conduct investigations, but a lot of people won't. So it's really important you know what resources you have in your local context that can do those sorts of things if they are required. So that's really important. If you don't have someone that's trained to conduct investigations, particularly investigations into child-on-child abuse, then you should not just have some random staff member conduct it. You need to know who externally you can bring in to look into these sorts of things.
Others, I hope that you have the poll in front of you. If you could please take these last 2 minutes to fill in your feedback. And but we really wanted to thank Sam. Sam, thank you for taking out the time. I think it's a great opportunity for all our members to learn so much from keeping children safe. And thank you for opening your doors to us. You know, honestly, you've given us so much. We've already written the workshops which are coming up, the WhatsApp group, the Spanish group coming up. I think that's so much to look forward to. So on behalf of...
Perfect. Well, I look forward to seeing lots of you at future KCS events and hopefully working with you all a lot more.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us so much information. We will share the slide deck as well. So everyone, thank you for joining us. And hope to see you in the next session.
Perfect. Have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Bye-bye.